Hello, everyone. Welcome to Republic Brief. Let me ask you something critical right now. When world leaders stop standing beside a U.S. president, when allies quietly step away, and when global silence replaces cooperation, what comes next? History gives us a clear answer. Conflict follows. And today, the world is turning its back on Donald Trump as the threat of war moves from speculation to reality. This is Republic Brief, and today we are breaking down a major global shift, one that signals not just political rejection, but a growing international alarm. Across the world, from European capitals to Middle Eastern power centers, a clear pattern is emerging. World leaders are distancing themselves from Trump's confrontational posture, and this collective withdrawal is reshaping the global balance of power. As a news analyst, it is important to cut through emotion and focus on strategy. Diplomatic rejection at this level is never personal. It is strategic. Trump's foreign policy approach, driven by pressure, public ultimatums, and unpredictability, has eroded confidence among allies. Global leadership relies on stability, coordination, and trust. When those pillars weaken, alliances fracture. Europe is the most visible example of this shift. NATO allies are no longer blindly following Washington's lead. Publicly, unity is emphasized. Privately, European leaders are planning for autonomy, questioning America's long-term reliability under Trump. The concern is simple but serious. Impulsive leadership increases the risk of being pulled into wars without clear goals or international support. In the Middle East, the consequences of this approach are even more dangerous. Escalating rhetoric, military positioning, and hardened alliances have pushed the region closer to open confrontation. Trump's preference for maximum pressure has narrowed diplomatic pathways, leaving little room for negotiation or de-escalation. Regional powers, sensing volatility, are recalibrating their alliances to protect themselves from the fallout of decisions made in Washington. Asia, meanwhile, is responding with caution and calculation. Major regional powers are strengthening independent security and economic strategies. Trade disputes, strategic threats, and abrupt policy shifts have created uncertainty about U.S. commitments. As a result, countries are preparing for a future where American leadership under Trump may be inconsistent or unreliable. What makes this moment particularly alarming is the global environment in which it is unfolding. The world is already facing economic instability, ongoing conflicts, and weakened international institutions. In such a fragile system, diplomatic isolation of a major power's leader is not symbolic, it is dangerous. When communication breaks down and allies disengage, the risk of miscalculation rises sharply. This is why the phrase "war is imminent" is not sensationalism, it is analysis. History shows that wars often begin when leaders misread silence as approval and resistance as weakness. Global rejection in this context is a defensive response by world leaders attempting to avoid being dragged into another large-scale conflict. It is also important to understand what this rejection truly represents. It is not anti-American sentiment. It is a rejection of a leadership style that prioritizes dominance over diplomacy. Global leaders are not abandoning cooperation. They are seeking stability in the absence of predictability. When global leaders stop picking up the phone, when invitations quietly disappear, and when silence replaces coordination, diplomacy doesn't just weaken, it collapses. And right now, that collapse is happening in real time. Diplomatic isolation around Donald Trump is accelerating, and history tells us this is often how the road to global conflict begins. Diplomatic isolation is not a headline-driven event. It is a slow, deliberate process. It begins with discomfort, grows into caution, and eventually turns into disengagement. What we are witnessing today is the final stage of that process. World leaders are no longer merely expressing concern over Trump's leadership style. They are actively distancing themselves from it. This is a strategic decision, not an emotional one, and it carries serious global consequences. In international politics, influence is measured not just by military power or economic size, but by trust. Trust allows alliances to function, agreements to hold, and crises to be managed before they spiral into war. Under Trump, that trust has steadily eroded. Allies have grown weary of sudden policy reversals, public ultimatums, and diplomacy conducted through confrontation rather than consensus. The result is a growing diplomatic vacuum around U.S. leadership. One of the clearest signs of this isolation is the shift in how global leaders engage with Washington. Meetings that once symbolized unity are now marked by caution. Joint statements are carefully worded, avoiding strong commitments. Behind closed doors, discussions are less about coordination with the U.S. and more about contingency planning without it. This is how diplomatic distancing manifests, not loudly, but decisively. Europe provides the strongest example. For decades, European allies viewed the United States as the anchor of global stability. Today, that perception is under strain. Trump's repeated challenges to NATO, questioning collective defense obligations, and treating alliances as transactional deals have forced European leaders to rethink their dependence on Washington. The concern is not ideological, it is practical. Allies fear being drawn into conflicts driven by unilateral decisions without international consensus. This isolation is also evident in multilateral institutions. Global forums that once relied on American leadership now operate with visible hesitation. When a leader undermines international agreements, dismisses global norms, and openly pressures allies in public, cooperation becomes fragile. Countries begin to ask a dangerous question: can we rely on this leadership during a crisis? Increasingly, the answer is no. Diplomatic isolation also weakens crisis management. When tensions rise, as they are now, leaders rely on trusted channels to de-escalate. But isolation shuts those channels down. Allies hesitate to intervene. Partners hold back advice. Communication slows. In such an environment, miscalculations become more likely. A single misunderstanding, a poorly worded threat, or an impulsive decision can trigger escalation before diplomacy has a chance to respond. Another critical aspect of this isolation is perception. In global politics, perception often becomes reality. When world leaders collectively signal distance from a U.S. president, rivals interpret that as weakness. Adversaries may feel emboldened, calculating that fractured alliances reduce the risk of unified retaliation. This dynamic does not prevent conflict, it invites it. It is also important to clarify what this diplomatic isolation is not. It is not anti-American sentiment. Many global leaders continue to value strong relations with the United States. What they are rejecting is a leadership style that prioritizes dominance over dialogue. They are separating America's long-term role from Trump's short-term unpredictability, and that distinction matters deeply. Historically, diplomatic isolation has preceded some of the most destabilizing conflicts. When leaders lose the confidence of allies, they are more likely to rely on force rather than cooperation. Isolation narrows options. It hardens positions. It creates an echo chamber where dissenting advice is ignored. And in moments of global tension, that combination is extremely dangerous. As isolation accelerates, the world becomes more fragmented. Regional blocs strengthen independently. Countries hedge their alliances. Neutrality becomes more attractive than loyalty. This fractured global order lacks the cohesion needed to prevent large-scale conflict. The absence of unified leadership does not create balance. It creates volatility. From a news analysis perspective, this is the most alarming development in global politics today. Diplomatic isolation is not a punishment. It is a warning. It signals that the international community no longer feels confident in shared leadership. And when confidence disappears, stability follows. Diplomacy thrives on trust, consistency, and restraint. When those elements collapse, isolation takes their place. And isolation is a breeding ground for conflict. The accelerating diplomatic rejection of Donald Trump is not just a political statement. It is a global alarm bell. The world is stepping back, not out of defiance, but out of fear. Fear that without cooperation, the path ahead leads not to negotiation, but to war. In global politics, allies can tolerate disagreement, but they cannot survive uncertainty. When partners no longer know what tomorrow's policy will be, trust collapses. And today, the single biggest reason world leaders are stepping back from Donald Trump is this: they no longer trust strategic predictability coming out of Washington. Point 2 goes to the very core of international relations. Power alone does not sustain alliances. Predictability does. Allies align themselves not just with strength, but with consistency. They need to know that commitments made today will still matter tomorrow, that red lines are real, and that decisions are guided by strategy rather than impulse. Under Trump, that predictability has steadily unraveled. Strategic unpredictability may be marketed domestically as toughness, but on the world stage, it is treated as instability. Allies are forced to ask dangerous questions. Will policy change overnight? Will a tweet override months of negotiations? Will a security guarantee still hold during a crisis? When these questions remain unanswered, trust erodes rapidly. One of the clearest examples of this breakdown is the constant shift in messaging. One day, diplomacy is encouraged. The next day, threats dominate the narrative. One moment, allies are praised. The next, they are publicly criticized. For foreign governments, this creates a planning nightmare. Long-term strategy becomes impossible when leadership signals change without warning. This uncertainty has forced allies to move from cooperation to caution. Governments now approach U.S. coordination defensively, limiting commitments and avoiding deep entanglements. Instead of joint planning, they prepare contingency options. Instead of alignment, they hedge. This is how alliances weaken, not through open confrontation, but through quiet disengagement. In international security, predictability is not optional. It is essential. Military coordination, intelligence sharing, and crisis response all rely on trust that partners will act as expected. When leadership appears impulsive, allies fear being dragged into escalations they did not approve and cannot control. As a result, they distance themselves to reduce exposure. Europe's reaction illustrates this perfectly. NATO partners are deeply uneasy with unpredictable leadership because a single miscalculation could trigger obligations under collective defense. European leaders are not questioning the alliance itself. They are questioning the reliability of the decision-making behind it. That distinction explains why trust, not loyalty, is the central issue. Economic policy has further compounded this problem. Sudden trade threats, abrupt tariff decisions, and inconsistent negotiations have created uncertainty in global markets. Allies that once relied on economic coordination with the U.S. now pursue diversified trade relationships to protect themselves. Predictability is the foundation of economic stability, and when it disappears, confidence follows. Another critical consequence of unpredictability is the breakdown of deterrence. Deterrence works only when intentions are clear and responses are credible. When signals are mixed, rivals may miscalculate. Adversaries might test boundaries, believing allies will not respond cohesively. This raises the risk of escalation, not because of aggression, but because of confusion. From a news analysis standpoint, this is where unpredictability becomes dangerous. Wars are often not caused by deliberate plans, but by misunderstandings. When leadership messages shift rapidly, allies and adversaries alike struggle to interpret intent. In such an environment, restraint weakens and reaction replaces strategy. It is also important to note that unpredictability isolates decision-makers internally. When advisors, diplomats, and military planners cannot anticipate leadership choices, institutional expertise loses influence. This concentrates power into narrower circles, reducing debate and increasing the likelihood of error. History repeatedly shows that isolated decision-making leads to strategic failure. Global leaders are responding rationally to this environment. They are not abandoning cooperation. They are insulating themselves. They build parallel alliances, strengthen regional partnerships, and reduce dependence on a single unpredictable actor. This is not betrayal. It is risk management. What makes this moment particularly serious is timing. The world is facing overlapping crises, security tensions, economic strain, and institutional weakness. In such conditions, predictability becomes even more valuable. Its absence magnifies every other risk. Allies know this, and their actions reflect that awareness. This erosion of trust has long-term consequences. Once predictability is lost, restoring confidence takes years, not months. Even if rhetoric softens, memories of instability remain. Global actors plan for the worst, not the best, and that mindset reshapes the international system. Trust is the currency of global leadership, and predictability is how that currency is maintained. When allies no longer know what to expect, cooperation gives way to caution, and unity dissolves into fragmentation. The loss of strategic predictability under Trump is not just a leadership flaw, it is a systemic risk. And in a world already on edge, uncertainty may prove more dangerous than open hostility. When your strongest allies begin planning a future without you, it is no longer a warning, it is a strategic shift. Across Europe, quiet but decisive moves are underway, signaling that long-standing faith in U.S. leadership under Donald Trump is being fundamentally reassessed. Point 3 focuses on Europe's response, and it is one of the most telling developments in this global realignment. For decades, Europe viewed the United States not just as an ally, but as the cornerstone of its security architecture. Today, that assumption is being carefully and deliberately re-examined. European leaders are not severing ties, but they are preparing for independence. This shift did not happen overnight. It is the result of repeated shocks to transatlantic trust. Trump's public questioning of NATO commitments, demands for financial contributions framed as ultimatums, and transactional approach to alliances have forced Europe to confront an uncomfortable reality. Reliance on U.S. leadership may now carry unacceptable risks. From a strategic perspective, Europe's concern is simple. Collective defense only works when commitments are absolute. Any ambiguity, especially from the alliance's most powerful member, weakens deterrence. When European leaders hear mixed signals about mutual defense obligations, they must plan for scenarios in which U.S. support is delayed, conditional, or absent. As a result, Europe is quietly investing in autonomy. Defense budgets are increasing. Joint European military initiatives are expanding. Strategic planning is shifting from dependency towards self-reliance. This is not anti-American sentiment. It is strategic insurance. European governments are ensuring they are not caught unprepared by sudden policy shifts in Washington. Diplomatically, the same recalibration is underway. European leaders are strengthening direct channels with regional and global powers, reducing the need to route every major initiative through Washington. Multilateral diplomacy is being emphasized as a stabilizing force, precisely because unilateral decision-making has become unpredictable. This move toward independence also reflects political reality within Europe. Leaders must answer to voters who are increasingly uneasy about being pulled into conflicts without clear justification or democratic consensus. Trump's confrontational rhetoric, particularly on military matters, raises fears of escalation without strategy. European governments cannot afford to outsource such risks. Economically, the picture is similar. Trade disputes, tariff threats, and sudden policy reversals have convinced European states that economic dependency can quickly become vulnerability. Diversification, both in trade and energy, has become a strategic priority. Stability, not alignment, is now the guiding principle. From a security standpoint, this shift carries serious implications. NATO remains intact, but cohesion is under strain. An alliance is strongest when its members act with shared confidence. When trust weakens, coordination slows, and response times increase. Europe's push for autonomy reflects concern that unity can no longer be taken for granted. This is also how power balances subtly change. As Europe becomes more independent, global leadership becomes more fragmented. Without a clear anchor, multiple centers of influence emerge. While this can increase flexibility, it also raises the risk of misalignment during crises, when speed and clarity are essential. Importantly, Europe's recalibration sends a message beyond the continent. It signals to other regions that even America's closest allies are no longer fully confident in U.S. leadership under Trump. That perception alone reshapes global calculations, influencing how rivals and partners alike position themselves. From a news analysis perspective, this is not a rebellion. It is a contingency plan. Europe is not abandoning the United States. It is preparing for uncertainty. And in global politics, preparation often matters more than declarations. Closing analysis. Europe's quiet move towards strategic independence is one of the strongest indicators that trust in U.S. leadership has weakened. When allies begin planning for autonomy, it reflects concern, not hostility. The transatlantic relationship is not collapsing, but it is transforming. And in times of global tension, transformation of this scale can redefine the balance between peace and conflict. When diplomacy disappears in the Middle East, conflict doesn't follow slowly. It explodes. And today, the region is standing at the edge of escalation, driven by rising pressure, hardened alliances, and a shrinking space for dialogue under Donald Trump's foreign policy approach. Point 4 centers on the Middle East, where the consequences of global rejection and confrontational leadership are most immediate and most dangerous. This region has long been defined by fragile balances of power, where diplomacy is not optional. It is essential for survival. Yet recent developments suggest those diplomatic safety nets are rapidly unraveling. Under Trump, the dominant strategy has been maximum pressure. In theory, pressure is meant to force compliance. In practice, it often eliminates incentives for negotiation. As threats increase and red lines harden, leaders become trapped by their own rhetoric. Backing down becomes politically costly, and compromise is framed as weakness. This is the exact environment in which miscalculation thrives. Regional powers are responding not with cooperation, but with militarization. Military readiness is being elevated, alliances are becoming more rigid, and communication channels are narrowing. In such a climate, even small incidents, a border clash, a missile test, a proxy confrontation, can spiral into broader conflict before diplomacy can intervene. Another critical issue is the sidelining of mediation. Historically, de-escalation in the Middle East relied on behind-the-scenes diplomacy, quiet negotiations, and trusted intermediaries. Today, those mechanisms are weaker. When leadership favors public pressure over private dialogue, opportunities for compromise disappear. Silence replaces negotiation, and tension fills the vacuum. The region's volatility also amplifies the consequences of diplomatic isolation. When global allies step back from U.S. leadership, regional actors feel less constrained. Without strong international coordination, local powers may act unilaterally, believing escalation can be managed or contained. History shows this belief is often dangerously wrong. From a strategic standpoint, the risk is not a single, deliberate decision for war, but an unintended chain reaction. Proxy conflicts intensify. Allies respond defensively. Red lines are crossed accidentally or deliberately. Without clear diplomatic off-ramps, escalation becomes the default outcome. This instability also impacts global security far beyond the region. Energy markets react to uncertainty. Refugee pressures increase. International shipping routes face disruption. The Middle East does not exist in isolation. Conflict there sends shockwaves through the global system. It is also important to understand how global rejection feeds into this dynamic. When world leaders distance themselves from Trump's approach, it limits coordinated pressure for restraint. Without unified international backing, diplomatic efforts lose weight. Regional actors begin to believe they must secure their interests alone, by force if necessary. From a news analysis perspective, this is the most dangerous phase of any conflict cycle, the moment when diplomacy is still possible, but no longer prioritized. The window for de-escalation narrows as pressure increases. Every statement, every movement, every signal carries heightened risk. This is why warnings about the Middle East must be taken seriously. The region has seen this pattern before. Rhetoric hardens, alliances lock in, diplomacy fades, and conflict follows. The current trajectory fits that historical model with alarming precision. The Middle East is not just tense, it is primed. When pressure replaces dialogue and global coordination weakens, escalation becomes a matter of time, not choice. Trump's confrontational approach has tightened the political space for peace, leaving the region closer to conflict than compromise. And in a region where mistakes are rarely contained, the cost of miscalculation would be felt far beyond its borders. Here at Republic Brief, we follow the signals others ignore, and the signal today is unmistakable. World leaders are turning their backs, alliances are shifting, and the margin for peace is narrowing. The question now is not whether the world is rejecting Trump. The question is whether this rejection will slow the march toward war or accelerate it. Because in global politics, when unity collapses, history rarely gives second chances.